We love being able to quantify everything. But I think the big thing is like, is it making, to put it in kind of simple terms, does it make the boat go faster? Okay, so does it keep us going in the direction we want to go? And are we going in a more efficient pattern than we were before? If it's not, then let's get rid of it.
Welcome to the Upside Strength Podcast, your number one resource for all things fitness and performance in Switzerland. Today, I'll be chatting with Kris Borthwick, sports performance coach specialized in tennis strength and conditioning. Hey, Kris, welcome to the podcast, man.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
It's good to have you on after having to reschedule a couple times, but we're finally here. So for people who don't know you yet, can you give a little bit of your background?
Yeah, sure. So obviously my name's Kris. I'm the Assistant Director of Sports Performance for Olympic Sports at Wake Forest University. I've been in this position for the last 3 years. And my main responsibilities working with the men's and women's tennis programs here.
Have you worked a lot with tennis in the past before this position you had 3 years ago?
Yeah, so I kind of grew up, if we kind of take it right back, I grew up playing tennis. It was my second sport, to be honest with you. My main sport was rugby. That was kind of my main love. And my sister was really the kind of tennis player in the family. And I was just kind of, if she was playing, I was like, oh, I may as well play as well. So my family kind of got us both lessons and that sort of stuff. But like, I wasn't that good, if I'm honest with you. Like, she was the good one. She played internationally, and she was a 5-year athlete at Florida State University. So yeah, that's kind of how I initially got into tennis, just playing. And then as kind of the classic like strength coach kind of story, we're not that good at sport, so we end up kind of trying to teach it or find ways to make ourselves better. So yeah, like that's kind of what happened with me. I went down that rugby route, and I played at a reasonable level rugby. I played like National 1. But that was, I found as soon as I started improving my physical side, that I actually like could withstand kind of the demands a little bit better on the field and things like that. So that's where I really kind of got into strength and conditioning. And then spending time around my sister when she'd come back, obviously from kind of university in the summer, like I'd write her programs, and that's kind of where it all started really as well. Then it just so happens, because I've got the experience of maybe playing tennis and working with a little bit of tennis, every stop along the way that I've had, whether it was my internship at Northumbria University, I went from there to Radley College, and then from there to the States. Initially at Northwestern State University, where I worked as an assistant strength conditioning coach and lectured a little bit as well. Then went back to the University of Bath, and now to my current position. It's kind of everyone, because there's not that many people that maybe or S&C coaches that have typically played tennis. Everyone's been like, oh, you know tennis, there you go. And that's kind of how it kind of evolved over the years. It started with just being like thrown, oh, here's a tennis team, you know about tennis, you've played tennis. So yeah, I just kind of one stop to another and just got more and more and more experience, almost by accident, if you like, within that tennis realm.
Can you talk a little bit about your transition from a team sport, rugby, into tennis, which is very much an individual sport? So how was it for you as an athlete to begin with? And then how did you transpose this experience into what you do now as a coach?
Yeah, so I think as an athlete, I didn't really find it like too difficult, because I was obviously playing like rugby a lot of the time, and then tennis was kind of something that I wasn't doing as my main sport. It was always just a backup, so I kind of just enjoyed it. I didn't really think of it very much. Obviously it's an individual sport, but I was still getting my kind of team camaraderie bit with rugby. So I didn't really think of it too much when I was growing up, or even initially, I suppose, when I first got into coaching and working with tennis. It was only kind of maybe of the past kind of 5, 6, 7 years even, those kind of things really became apparent to me. And especially as you actually step into the collegiate environment and you see, okay, well, tennis is typically this individual sport, which everyone knows. You're playing for yourself. You're trying to make money if you're on the professional tour for yourself, and maybe your team if you're kind of lucky enough to have a team around you. So you literally don't care about anyone else, and it's the same growing up. But then all of a sudden you come to college and you're in this team environment. So like on our men's team, we've got a team of like 18 guys, which is huge in college tennis. We've got a women's team of 10 women. And then you're put into this environment where you're you're playing for yourself. So I'll explain the kind of the rules around college tennis quickly. You play 3 doubles matches, so there's six players on the court, over 3 courts, should I say, and you've got to win 2 out of 3 doubles matches essentially to get 1 point.
Mm-hmm.
Once the doubles is done, then you go into singles play, and you play best of 3 sets. There's 6 singles matches, and there's 6 points on offer. So 7 points total. Obviously, you've got to win 4 out of those 7 to get the W. So even in this environment where it's a team environment, you're still to an extent playing for yourself, because you need to be fully focused on what's happening like on your court. You need to win for you first and foremost, but then you also need to win for the team, because winning for you helps improve your individual ranking within the kind of national collegiate system, but then also you end up winning for the team if your point, so to speak, your W goes towards the other, like for the rest of the team. And that ends up all coming together. So you could win kind of 4-3, for example. And it's kind of weird that they end up playing for a team. And I think it takes a lot of these guys that are coming in playing junior tennis for themselves quite a bit of time to adapt to that team environment. Because if I'm pretty honest, like, tennis players are very selfish. They only care about themselves. And to be honest, that's probably the case in a lot of sports, where you just don't typically see that team camaraderie. So for athletes coming in from playing around Europe and things like that, playing for themselves, it typically takes them a little bit of time to adapt, to get into that team environment. So they're used to playing not only for themselves, but trying to win for the team. And you'll see a lot of the time when athletes leave college, they really miss that team environment. And some of them will almost have these aspirations to play pro, but they won't go pro, or they will go pro for maybe a year or 2 and then stop because they miss that team environment. And that's so important to them. And I think it took me a little bit of time to realize that. And then one of the biggest examples of this is if you're in the weight room, for example. So you're in the gym with maybe a group of rugby athletes, and you can be kind of shouting out your instructions, your coaching points and things like that. Or you might shout across the room to someone that's, I don't know, just a certain coaching cue, whatever. But because they're in a team environment, that's normal for them. They're used to being like coached in front of a large group. Whereas if you're in a individual sport like tennis and golf, this is something that took me a bit of time to understand, is they don't really appreciate that kind of being coached in front of a large group aspect. They want that one-on-one interaction. So if I'm working with a tennis player that's maybe especially a freshman, so they're in the first year of my program, I'm going to approach that on a one-on-one basis instead of just kind of shouting a coaching cue maybe across the platform where everyone can hear. I'm going to like just walk over to them, maybe pull them aside and just have that little conversation, make it a little bit more personal, because that's what they're used to. They're used to having 1, 2, 3 coaches on court, all giving them this one-on-one kind of attention. Whereas in the team sport environment, it's just completely different. They're used to being, I'm not going to say shouted at, but in some cases they are shouted at in front of a large group. So that's definitely the dynamic that took me a little bit of time to understand. And I think one of the main differences there as well.
It's you've answered my follow-up question already. My question was going to be, how much impact or involvement do you have as an S&C coach on this psychological aspect of transitioning from an individual environment to a team environment? To push that one step farther, how do you know when they're ready to be treated as a part of a team, as opposed to having to maybe just tailor to the one-on-one side that they were used to before?
I don't think it's necessarily, it doesn't just happen. So it's not just like the switch flicks and it doesn't just happen like that. It's quite a gradual process. But the signs I look for are they interacting with kind of the seniors? So maybe the older girls or guys on the team throughout the sessions and things like that. Are they more comfortable communicating with them? Is their body language better as the weeks and months progress? So because initially as they come in, they might be quite kind of rounded shoulders, head down, just trying to get on with their work and almost stay out of the limelight. Whereas you've got the seniors that kind of beat the chest, and they're very confident and kind of proud about what they're part of a team. And it's just little signals like that. Like you can see their confidence grow. And especially as they get better at maybe certain lifts and things like that, maybe they've never done them before. You can see their confidence grow over the weeks and months that you're with them. And it's, like I say, it's not necessarily the switch just flicks. It's just something that gradually happens over time. And you learn from speaking with kind of the girls and guys on the team, that how the integration is going within the team. Are they enjoying their time here? Are they not only what's happening within the sporting environment, but the academics as well? Like, how are they doing in the classroom? And it's having those kind of one-on-one conversations with the athletes that makes quite a big difference. And then speaking with the coaches as well, like, how are they doing it? How do the coaches see that they're doing in school? And just trying to get an idea of the big picture, because kind of we see them for, if you go in the weight room, like we run quite short, sharp sessions, 30 to 45 minutes daily. So if I was to just see them in the gym, which luckily I don't, then I'm only seeing them for 30 to 45 minutes a day. And that's just such a small snapshot of what's going on. So I've really got to, in our performance meetings, that's one of the things that we discuss, like how's everyone kind of integrated in, and how's everything, how are kind of all the goals progressing, for example, in the academia side of things, which is very important, because if you're not doing well academically, then you can't play.
No, that makes sense. To come back to your prior experience in rugby, what are some of the elements that you've been able to bring from your rugby years, your rugby experience as a player, into the tennis realm? I know it might be a little far-fetched, but there's always things that we can bring from our prior experiences, even if they're in completely different sports. So what are maybe the one or two things that you've been able to carry over?
Yeah, I think it's just that team camaraderie, trying to get them around each other. Like, if you're in a big rugby team, there's always lots of kind of just banter going around, high fives and stuff like that. Now, as they get more confident around each other, there's more like free flowing banter and stuff like that. But one of the things we do, it's a very American thing to do, and I stayed away from it a little bit when I kind of first came to the States, and it's just getting a break at the end of each session that they're with me. So each group's kind of got their own little way to break it down. So it's little things like that that they like doing as well. And if I almost forget to do it with the team, they remind me. They're like, Kris, no, we need to get the break. And it's like each team's got their own unique thing that only they do. It's just that way that they like kind of bringing everyone together. And I know in rugby, a lot of teams have their own little routine before they go out to play, where it's kind of like 1, 2, 3 squeeze and things like that. Some people listening to this will have no idea what that means, but it's essentially like getting a break in American football.
Right.
But yeah, it's kind of like that. And it's just bringing that team camaraderie together. And that one part at the end of the session, the girls in particular love it, because it makes them feel, all right, we've just completed this, whether it's this task or this like goal in the session itself. We've got that done. And let's get a break. Yeah.
You've talked about the performance meetings that you have with the sporting staff around you. So how do you make those performance meetings as productive as possible? Make sure that they don't run too long, and make sure you just kind of stick to what is important for the players, and then just move on to the rest of the day.
Yeah, I actually think it's a really important thing to understand, and it's something that I've been trying to improve myself over the last few years. One thing I do, I set a time limit. We say, okay, 30 minutes max, absolute maximum. And one thing I do to make sure, and this is just to get through everything, more often than not, we can get it all done in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. But I actually class it as a stand-up meeting. So at the moment, because the way we're structured here at Wake, the tennis facility is actually off campus, and obviously with COVID restrictions and things like that. So I introduced it just as a Zoom meeting instead of being face-to-face, which obviously works better with COVID. And the fact that they are off campus. But as part of that meeting, I class it as a stand-up meeting. So during the whole meeting, I'm standing and then just kind of obviously communicating through Zoom. And that makes me like fully focused. As soon as I sit down, I don't feel quite as focused. And I think there's a little bit more of a tendency to potentially let things slip within the meeting. So I do that for a start. I set a time limit for each meeting. And I stand up. I have it as like a standing meeting. And then the other thing I really do, I have a checklist. So I have a checklist of exactly what I need to go through for the meeting. I lead the meeting for the most part, and I have my checklist and go through it. And whether that is, so I've actually got my list for next week just on the board here. So that might be something like the weekly plan. What are we looking at to go through that week? What are the sessions? What's the coach looking for in their sessions, in their technical, tactical sessions? What am I going to be doing in my strength and conditioning sessions? Anything that kind of we need to talk about in relation to sleep, for example, because we'll look at their sleep data as well. We'll go through some of the data. Any RTP, so return to play athletes that we're looking at, where are they at in their kind of schedule? What are they looking at this week? Because the athletic trainers in that meeting as well. so we can check in there. Scheduling options, obviously, and yeah, that's kind of the main kind of crux of it. But one of the big things that we do is I created a Google Drive. I created a Google Drive. I didn't create Google Drive. Let's just get that out there. But I created a shared area on Google Drive where we have our like women's tennis platforms, so to speak. So within that platform, as far as our return to play information goes, everything's on there. So everything about the team, whether it's individual schedules, team schedules, performance testing, load monitoring, sleep data, that sort of stuff, that's all on there. So if we look at things in terms of key performance indicators, my staff that I work with can tell me what those KPIs are. And I think that's very important, because if they're key, I think everyone should have access to them and everyone should know what they are. It's no good just the strength and conditioning staff kind of knowing what we're looking for in terms of maybe outputs and things like that. I think everyone needs to have this understanding. So that's one thing I set out from day one is, okay, well, this is our shared platform. This is where we store everything for our kind of return to play, key performance indicators for our return to play, as well as our performance tests and things like that, and our weekly schedules. So that's where we store everything, and that just makes everything so much easier. So when we're coming for our meeting, so we have a meeting every Monday morning with the women's tennis team at 11 o'clock. Before we go into that meeting, everyone's already been able to look at kind of the load monitoring data, for example, from the week before. So as I'm bringing it up in the meeting, they've already seen it, they've got access to it. There's no sudden surprises. And I think it's just really important to be able to communicate and just collaborate as a group and not hide anything from anyone. And that's the kind of most important thing. If you're talking high performance, unfortunately, it's not like pretty colorful charts and things like that. It's simple communication. That's something I've definitely learned over the last kind of year or so. But yeah, that's what we do. We cap it at 30 minutes. I treat it as a stand-up meeting. I have my checklist, and we share everything. We're pretty open and honest about the whole process.
So data is obviously a very important tool. The higher you go in the levels, the more important it becomes. But how do you make sure that the amount of data that you guys collect and that you try to analyze doesn't become a hindrance to the actual performance? How do you make sure that you're just sticking to the things that you need to assess in order to impact positively the training process?
Yeah, so I think like we've all probably been guilty of this in the past. Like we love flashy new toys and stuff like that. We love these numbers. We love being able to quantify everything. But I think the big thing is like, is it making, to put it in kind of simple terms, does it make the boat go faster? Okay, so does it keep us going in the direction we want to go? And are we going in a more efficient pattern than we were before? If it's not, then let's get rid of it. So we use certain kind of metrics that we look at, and there's certain metrics that we don't. So we get loads of data from, let's just say like Whoop, for example. So Whoop gets a bad rap at times. There's obviously pros and cons to it. So we use it for looking at session duration and then RP as well. And obviously you can get a strain value and heart rate from that. There's certain things, I think if you try to dig into every little bit of data, you're going to be overawed. And especially depending on the size of your like sports science team or data analytics team, you can be very easily overawed with everything that it spits out of you, especially if you look at things like Catapult and all the data you get. I think you've got to have an idea, just like we do with our performance meetings, have an idea of what the metrics are that you're wanting to look at. So whether it's high speed distance, number of accelerations, total distance covered, know what you're looking for, and then have that understanding within your team. And then don't try and chase all of these other metrics just because they're available to you, because everyone likes, like I say, everyone likes these kind of flashy gadgets and gizmos and things like this. Can you just get what you need from it and then use that information to actually inform practice? Because if we're not using it to inform practice, then we've just wasted like $10,000. And at the moment with COVID and budget restrictions and things like that, we cannot afford to waste that sort of money.
What are some of the data points that you might have paid a lot of attention to in the past, and that with your experience now you pay less attention to, or maybe even don't use anymore?
So I think if we use the Whoop example, we'll stick with that because that is something that we use with the women's tennis team. That gives you kind of a strain value, sleep scores, HRV, total time trained, session
Mm-hmm.
duration, like loads of data. I used to try and look at all of that sort of stuff and look at like the strain value it gave you and try to use it to inform practice. But then I was kind of getting away from some of the more important things in terms of, okay, well, what's our actual, just keep it really simple. What's our session duration? What's the RPE post session for the session, just to give us a basic training score.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much the only thing I look at there, as well as I actually look at the recovery data more in terms of sleep. So we know if athletes get 8 hours or more sleep, they're doing pretty well, they're going to be able to recover. If they're not, then they're probably not doing a great job and they're not going to recover. So they're the only two things from like the Whoop device that we actually look at now. So I look at the total session duration times RPE to give us a like arbitrary number for our training load. And then we go, I look at, and just kind of more daily, just look at just to make sure that the girls are actually managing to get a good amount of sleep every night. And that's more of a habit creating thing, because if you're just getting 5 hours sleep, there's no way you can recover every night and then return the next day to perform at a high level. So that's just an education platform. And I think that's one thing Whoop is good for. You can see what your sleep is. Where it kind of gets bashed a little bit is around the HRV and the heart rate and things like that. So I don't necessarily look at it for that at the moment. I just use it as, if I do look at the heart rate in terms of intensity around practice, it's just as, okay, well, I just want to see how much time they're spending in each zone and things like that. But am I using that to kind of guide training prescription? No, not necessarily. Did I in the past? Yes. And that's when I got overawed with loads of numbers and I was like just confusing myself.
So kind of stick to the basics, keep an eye on what on those data points that you get, but don't necessarily change everything that you do because you see a certain shift up or down.
Yeah, and I think you just don't need to necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater just because you see all of a sudden something go, training loads like really high on one day, or like just something's happened. It's like, well, let's just settle with it a little bit. We'll look at how it is over like a 28-day period, for example. We've got our high days and low days built in. The coaching staff are very on board with that sort of stuff, and that's things we discuss weekly in our performance meeting. We've got the weekly model that we try to stick to. That's going to adapt depending on obviously our in-season schedule, but everyone's on the same page regarding to kind of what's happening with our kind of training week and things like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to come back to your experience playing tennis in the UK and then now being in the US. What are some of the major differences in strength and conditioning culture within tennis that you found between Europe in general and then the US where you are now?
So starting in Europe, typically a lot of the players that we get on the men's side are from Europe. So we typically see them with not much kind of experience in and around like weightlifting, or strength training. That's a better term to use. So everything's kind of based around, not everything, but there's a lot of things on kind of Bosu balls and things like this, and just not what we would typically class as like strength training. And it's a lot of kind of simulation instead of stimulation. Whereas you kind of flip the script and go to the US, then it's very much the American kids like lifting weights. They want to be strong. They see the quality in it, or the benefits from it. I think that's a lot more to do with the American culture than anything else that comes from kind of American football and being strong, and very much like a quantitative background in terms of putting big numbers up on the back squat and stuff like that. So there's definitely a difference that we see. Does strength make you a good tennis player though? No. That's the thing. So, and it just makes you a little bit more robust to those demands that you're going to face. And that's kind of the conversation that we're having. And that's something that like I've changed over the years. Like, I suppose when everyone gets into the fields thinking that, or I did, let's just put it that way. I did that. You think that initially that strength's kind of the number one kind of savior. Just get them super strong. If they can squat kind of 1.6, 1.7 times or whatever it is, times body weight, then you're good to go. And that's just so far from the truth. And like all of the numbers I've been running and stuff like that just don't say that. Now, again, it's let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. That doesn't mean we don't say it. We don't train strength, but we just got a little bit more direction to go with our programming.
So for you at this point in time, with all your experience up until now, how strong is strong enough for a tennis player?
we're still kind of getting there, but I like the numbers I've kind of run and things like that, admittedly, and this is where I kind of I'm trying to reach out to other colleagues in the game so I can get their data as well, because my sample size is pretty small. I've been lucky that some other colleagues have some of their information, but if we look at the moment, we're kind of around a 1.6, 1.65 times body weight trap bar deadlift, which isn't really kind of that much. And even to be honest with you, it could be less than that. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at the moment. We're looking at reactive strength. That's one of the kind of KPIs that I use, of anywhere between 2.7 to 3.0 for our best athletes. That's been pretty consistent across the athletes, the best athletes that I've worked with over the last 3 years over here. And then like lower body power output as well. So like watts per kilogram, that's a constant across the board. Obviously, the more powerful you are relative to body weight, and that's how we test that through the like count movement jump hands on hips. Then that's pretty much like very strong correlation to those like higher performers in the game. And honestly, one of the best correlations that I found is the ability to change direction. Funnily enough, in a change direction sport, the best players do that best.
Right.
But then you kind of dig into the data as well, and you say, okay, well, does strength improve change direction ability? Are they correlated? Not that well, unfortunately. Now people have probably just like fallen off their chairs, because everything, obviously, we look at triphasic and we try to increase eccentric strength and the change direction so we can minimize the amount of time spent in the change direction. And you think it just doesn't make sense, but that's just kind of what I'm seeing. Like I say, my sample size isn't that big. It's okay, but that's kind of what I'm seeing at the moment. Change direction has got a near perfect correlation to the best players that we see. And I'm quite lucky that some of the players we've got here are some of the best players in the country. And then those that go on to play pro as well. But yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing at the moment. And that's kind of where we're going with it. But yeah, I don't necessarily think strength is the be all end all. It's certain quality of strength, maybe like eccentric, rate of force development, and things like that.
How much of a place does upper body strength training have for a tennis player?
Definitely, I think it does. But it's obviously, we're not talking about like the show muscles necessarily. It's more about the go muscles. I think people maybe try and get tennis players like quite muscular and things like that, and that's obviously not necessarily needed, because they've got to carry that around on court in college for around 3 hours, kind of worst case scenario. If you're looking at the pros, you could be 5 hours plus if they're going to grand slams and things like that, playing best of five. But yeah, it's upper body strength is important. I don't necessarily have the data on that right now. That's something that we're actually kind of pulling together at the moment to see where we're at. But it is important, especially with regards to kind of rotator cuff and things like that. But then again, it's okay, well, it's fantastic that you're kind of doing your external rotations and your cable machine and stuff like that. But then how much does that actually transfer to the field? So that's when we started using more high velocity methods as well. So we do like just trying to get a little bit closer to the demands that we see. So like catch release variations on the cable machine, overspeed band variations as well, kind of what you see that like Carl Dietz has kind of released, that type of stuff, where you're just trying to tap into the kind of reciprocal inhibition and things like that. So you really push pull through that rotator cuff, the muscles in there. And that's kind of the stuff that we're working on. Do I have a way of like measuring that? Not really. It's pretty tough. And again, I'm just trying to run the numbers on it at the moment, and we're trying to collect more data. But like upper body strength relative to first serve velocity and things like that, is it important? Do we actually need it? It's still kind of up in the air.
From the standpoint of the athletes themselves, and talking about the transfer to the game, what are some of the strength movements or exercises that you guys have used where the athletes actually feel that they do benefit from it on the court afterwards?
Yeah, so again, that kind of varies, to be honest with you, athlete to athlete, which maybe sounds a bit weird. But I think with it being such an individualized sport, you've got to be very aware and communicate with the athletes. So if we're going through a strength block, for example, and we train strength all year round for the most part, But it's very much down to the athlete on what they want to do. So if I'm speaking to an athlete and I say, okay, well, or we've maybe got back squats today, for example, athlete might be like, Kris, I don't like back squats. I'm like, all right, no worries. What do you want to do? Do you want to do front squats? Don't really like front squats. Trap bar deadlift? Maybe. Leg press? Okay, leg press. And like people, again, probably just fell off their seats, but it doesn't matter. It's a stimulus. We can kind of get some of those other qualities that maybe a leg press is missing. And we can put that into the program elsewhere. But is the athlete fully bought into the program as a result of that? Yes. Versus I tried to force a square peg into a round hole and tried to make them back squat, which they just hate doing. So we don't do that. A lot of like our strength work at the moment, we look at a lot of kind of frontal plane work with different like lateral lunge variations and things like that, working at different velocities as well. We go like skater squats, split squats, so floating heels split squats we're actually doing at the moment as well. And then our only kind of bilateral lift is a trap bar deadlift. And that's the only, we do that once a week on our high force day. That's the only kind of bilateral lift we do. And that's something that, and we've taken a very much a low volume approach to everything we do this year. Obviously coming off the back of, still in COVID, but coming off the back of not doing much through the summer. I took a micro-dosed approach where we just used 2 sets of 5 across the board for our main lifts. Obviously accessories differ, but still sticking to that 2 sets. And we've had pretty good success with that, like all the kind of the needles moving in the right direction, so to speak. I've been very happy. The girls in particular have been saying that they feel like fantastic. They feel fresher than they've ever done, which is good, because at the end of the day, our job's to make them hit the yellow fuzzy thing better than they did before. So that's the only thing I care about, really.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned the yellow fuzzy thing. That's a good one. So I like your approach of essentially using whatever exercise will work for that athlete on that day to get the stimulus that you're after. Have you been met with any resistance from maybe prior coaches or maybe older coaches or coaches that adhere to a more old school way of doing things where it's kind of my way or the highway? The athletes are not here to tell us what they need. We're here to give them what they should do. And that's kind of the end of it.
Yes and no, but it's my program, so I kind of run it how I want, if I'm honest with you, without sounding like a dick. But it's like I'll reach out for advice and stuff like that from various people, but I know what's works well for my athletes. Yeah. I like to think I do. I'm the one that's on the shop floor with them X amount of hours per day, 7 days per week, like throughout the year. So if someone else is trying to tell me, oh, look, you need to squat to depth, and if your ass isn't touching the floor on your bilateral squat and they can't squat, like they can't back squat 1.6 times body weight, whatever, I'm like, well, the terminology you can't really use in a podcast, but like it's just irrelevant. It's like, let's stop having this argument. It's the same thing about the Olympic lifts. Like, do we need to Olympic lift for better performance? Like, no, we don't. But like, I don't want to get into the reasons behind that, but it's like, you just don't need to do that. And I think as long as we're still kind of arguing about these things within strength and conditioning, like there's much more pressing issues that we need to be trying to discuss. Like, can we actually get them, like I said, hit the yellow fuzzy thing a bit better than they did last week? That's the only thing that matters. And that's where my KPIs are moving. It's like my strength KPIs don't really matter that much. They're important for robustness reasons. But like I said, with my main KPIs at the moment are RSI, lower body power output, 10 meter sprint time. We're looking at 5:05, and then we're also looking at things on court in terms of like first serve velocity. That's a much more important KPI that the athlete actually cares about versus their back squat number. If you ask a tennis player what their back squat number is, they'll be like, I don't know, I don't care. Ask them what their biggest serve is, then they start to care a little bit more. So that's kind of that's much more important to me. And I don't, like I said, I don't really, if there's that old school mentality, just you be you. If you're happy doing that and your athlete's getting good results, hey man, that's great. But this is kind of the way that I'm running with it. Like, this is kind of the information that I've been collecting for the last 3+ years. This is what this is telling me to do. If you're getting good results your way, hey, keep doing it. This is currently what's working for my guys. When it stops working, I'll change it.
You talked about the demands of tennis, the demands of the game. You did a great presentation that you shared on YouTube. I'll link that in the podcast description for those who are interested in viewing it. what are some of the things that you discovered through your research process for that presentation that you maybe didn't expect from tennis prior to diving into really understanding what the game is made of?
I think the number one thing that I kind of knew but didn't know, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of had an inkling that was the idea, but I didn't have like the research necessarily until I really started digging into the weeds of kind of what was out there and to kind of back up my opinions. Because we've all sat there and kind of watched a sport on the TV, got our stopwatch out and timed every point. And it's until you actually break down like a full match over 3 sets, which like I say could be 3 hours, and really delve into kind of what the match consists of, you don't really understand the sport. And I think that's really important. So as I got into the weeds of the data and the information and kind of just looking through the literature and then watching my guys, that was when I really understood that, okay, well, tennis, the average point length in college tennis is 6.37 seconds, I think it is, or 36 seconds. Okay, so that's not producing these huge kind of, and you're going to hate this term, so excuse me, these lactic conditions, okay, that we...
I can roll with that. I can roll with
that. There we go. These conditions that loads of coaches go on about. Like, look, we know tennis is a repeat sprint sport, okay, but at the end of the day, it's very much, in my opinion, quite an alactic aerobic sport. And if we use that terminology, and the aerobic system is going to underpin everything that we do. And I think what a lot of coaches forget is they term it kind of anaerobic and lactic, glycolytic, like whatever you want to call it. And they say, oh, it's repeat sprint. So then they train in this way. And it's like, well, look at the actual demands of the sport, first and foremost. What are the demands that you're actually seeing on the court? What are your demands that the literature's kind of showing you? And then let's put 2 and 2 together and see what we get. And the fact of the matter is that you're looking in college tennis, I think 62% of rallies are 0 to 4 shots. So 62% of the time, that's serve, return, 1-2, rally done. At the most, that's 4 shots. So like that's a lot of the time that we're actually not going beyond 7 seconds. Okay, so then you start breaking down, okay, well, what's the point duration 0 to 4? What's the point duration kind of up to 7, up to 9, up to 12? And you see that realistically, worst case scenario in tennis, you're probably playing for around 40 seconds nonstop. You're going to rest for 20 because that's what we've got in college tennis. So you're working at a work to rest ratio of around 2 to 1 at the worst case scenario. So do we need to prepare for that? 100% we do. Because those long points are usually the ones that maybe a juice point in a game that's going to be the deciding factor. So we've got to be prepared for that. But is that the norm? No, that's not necessarily the norm. So the thing that we need to prepare for, in my eyes, is around the serve and return, because we know that's where the bulk of our points are kind of won and lost. So in the men's game in particular, obviously having a big serve is important. I'd almost argue in the women's game, having a big serve is more important, because who's been the most dominant player in the women's game for the last however many, like the last decade or more? Serena Williams. She can serve the biggest on tour. So if you're just getting 3 points, like we love 3 points. So if you're getting 3 points, why wouldn't you chase like a high first serve percentage, number one, and then a velocity and accuracy, number two? So for me, that just makes sense to chase those high alactic outputs. Now, and Serena Williams, if you look at her, she's a very powerful athlete as well. Now, I'm not saying we train all of our athletes to kind of look like Serena Williams necessarily, because it's obviously down to the individual. Your game style is going to come into it as well. But I think understanding in a sporting context, okay, what's your athlete's game style? What does that game style actually involve on the court? And then how can we kind of work back from that to give them the requisite physical qualities they need to be able to perform at the highest level? And more often than not, when they're on the court doing their drills and things like this, that they're practicing at a very medium intensity activity. They're not necessarily moving at high velocities. They're not working at velocities kind of low enough to kind of help with recovery and things like that. So that's something that we've started doing as a staff, is actually saying, okay, well, these are our high days, these are our low days. these are when, like, these drills are going to fall on our high days because we know the physiological response they're giving us for the most part. And then these drills are going to fall on our low days. Now, does it always work out perfectly? Absolutely not. But I think the important thing is we're moving in the right direction. Like, the program's not perfect. I'd be lying if I said it was, but we're moving in the right direction. And now, can you go all the time high, low, high, low, high, low within tennis? No. Okay. Like, the high, low system created by Charlie Francis was made for a track athlete where you can go high, low throughout the week and peak for a certain event. The reality is, in tennis, we may need to go back to back. We might need to play a Friday and a Saturday, or we might even need to go Friday, Saturday, Sunday, for example. So we've still got to be prepared to play in those environments. So our training week might look like, for example, we might go Monday high, Tuesday low, Wednesday high, Thursday low, Friday high, Saturday high, because we know we've got to prepare for those demands. So in terms of our Friday high, that might be something like tie breaks, like competition. We need competitive play to kind of drive the intensities, but maybe a slightly lower volume high day. And then our Saturday, we might go a kind of high intensity, high volume, where we're looking at higher training load values because we've got to replicate the demands of the performance environment. Then Sunday we'd take off and we'd go again. And obviously that's just one example, but we manipulate those demands depending on kind of the game schedule that we've got set up. And that's something that we've been working on a lot over the last few years. And we're actually making some pretty good progress there now. It started off with me just giving a menu, for lack of a better word, to my sports coaches and saying, look, this is what high day looks like. This is what a low day looks like. We're going to go with a technical tactical speed emphasis here. We're going to go with a technical tactical kind of endurance emphasis here. And then let's work with these. These are your kind of work to rest ratios. And it's giving them the tools to be able to inform their coaching drills as well. Then being able to say, from my point of view, okay, well, this type of drill here, where we're going like 2x1 line, for example, in tennis, that type of drill is going to elect an 80% plus heart rate response, for example. There's going to be some high velocity changes of direction in there. That needs to go on this day. And now the coaches are like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And we can start, it's tactical periodization at the end of the day. But tennis is so far behind that we're just starting to try and influence kind of decision making around the kind of program on court periodization at the moment. And it is slowly getting there, but we are kind of, like I say, we are making progress.
I want to come back to that high-low model that you've been able to implement in the program. But before that, you mentioned the importance of the serve in tennis. So if you had to break it down, how would you compare, or how would you say it's more of a physical movement, more of a technical movement? How does those two abilities balance out in the serve itself? And can you, as an S&C coach, have much influence on the serve as a movement in itself?
Yes and no. Now, this is another area that I'm still trying to improve on. This is where I've been speaking to Stephen Jones quite a lot. The guy's a genius in terms of this, like especially with obviously fast bowling. Can we overload key positions within tennis? Now, I think the way I look at the serve at the moment, now if you ask me again in 6-12 months time, my opinion might be completely different because I'm just learning as we go along. But at the moment, I look at two types of server. We have more of an elastic server, like an elastic driven athlete, which we typically see sprinting and like in an athletic sense anyway, and a muscle driven server. Now, their stances and their approach to how they actually obviously generate force are completely different. So if we look at a elastic server, for example, typically, more often than not, what you'll see is they drag the back leg. So if we look at serve, for example, as they go into the toss, as their loading phase, they'll drag the back leg towards the front leg. And if you don't understand, any listeners kind of don't understand what I'm talking about here, just go on YouTube and kind of throw in like Roger Federer serve. He's not necessarily a drag the back leg type of guy, but you'll be able to pick up a few things pretty quickly. So you've got someone that drags the back leg. Now, typically you'll see that in your kind of taller athletes, from my experience as well. But that for me is more typically what you'll see is more of an elastic athlete. But then you'll take as well someone that's more of like a muscle driven athlete that squats a little bit more. So someone that sits into the back hip and tries to drive off both legs instead of kind of just using the elastic qualities that they've got. And then, like I say, that's generally what you'll find in kind of the shorter athletes, kind of 6'2" or below. Again, a bit of a generalization, but just what I've seen from kind of my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, so I think there's a lot of obviously technical qualities that are involved in that. From our point of view, can we create stiffness at the right time during the right phases of the serve? Are we creating the right kind of, like, we'll use the word stiffness again, as they're kind of loading, going into that kind of like loading phase on the serve, and we go for that kind of trophy position where the ball and the racket's up in the air, we're getting the hips in the right position. Are they strong enough to actually hold and maintain that position during the loading phase before they kind of let rip? Are they strong enough in the rotator cuff muscles during the follow-through phase, where there's 0.75 times body weight forces, distraction forces going through the shoulder? So there are some of the questions that we can ask from a physical standpoint. Okay, are we checking those boxes? Now, I think that comes back again, the velocities that they're going through. When you're looking at 3,000 degrees per second going around the shoulder during a serve, that's pretty fast. So it's, how do you kind of measure that and quantify all of that? There's some of the questions, again, that we're trying to ask and we're trying to answer. Mm-hmm. So I don't have necessarily all of the answers yet, but I'm trying to speak to people much smarter than myself to help me kind of inform my opinion on this and kind of help program design and things like that.
Going back to the high-low model that you've been putting into place, what are some of the compromises that you've had to do? So you talked about the back-to-back high days. That's definitely one of them. If we take as a reference the ideal model, the philosophically pure model of high-low training, if we will, mm-hmm. What are some of the other adjustments that you've had to make to actually make it work in a practical setting and within tennis, which, like you said, is a different sport than track and field?
Yeah, I think obviously the volumes are going to be slightly different as well. I think one of the main ways that we've had success and kind of leaning towards having more success, I think at the moment, is just using it in terms of what you might typically look at. This is not necessarily, I suppose it is related to high-low, but in terms of like small-sided games. Mm. So if you look at your like small-sided games in like soccer, for example, your small-sided games are going to crank up heart rate and things like that, and going to cause, because of the change directions, they're going to cause more like eccentric damage. So you're going to potentially create more muscle soreness and such like. Whereas if we go in tennis, if we were to use kind of a small-sided game in half court, this is the way I kind of break it up. We go high day is a full court, low day is a half court. Mm. So if we were to go kind of small-sided games, some people might interpret that as, oh, that's a half court, but we wouldn't see much change of direction. We don't see many velocities there in terms of like acceleration, decelerations, because it's more kind of static, slight footwork, patterns, adjustments, so we can actually hit and drill. Mm-hmm. Whereas on our high days, because of just the dimensions that we're dealing with, that's where we see the kind of increased number of accelerations, decelerations, obviously as a result of that, the change directions, the velocities that we see. So kind of, again, just giving the coaches that menu to work from, saying, okay, well, on a high day, let's see more of these full court drills. On our low day, let's maybe play doubles, where there's going to be less kind of high speed movements. Mm-hmm. We can get some more technical, tactical learning emphasis on these days. And we can, if we want to use like our tempo hitting drills and stuff like that, we can build in some volume into our low days, which classically in kind of Charlie Francis term would be, all right, we're going to get our lots of tempo running in, but in here, we're going to get our tempo hitting in. We're going to build up our volume on court in terms of hitting, get our tissue preparation done on that side of things. So that's kind of, I don't know if that necessarily kind of answers your question, but it's how we kind of manipulate those variables because to kind of fit in with tennis. And I think a lot of people maybe interpret Charlie's work and try to just like cut and paste it and say, okay, well, we're going to be running 2x10, 100 yards between 65 and 75%. And I think, well, if I was to do that for my tennis players, that's not really specific mm-hmm. because they change direction 79% of the time on the court, or between 75 and 80% of the time. So, and it's all lateral movement between 75 and 80% of the time. So mm-hmm. Linear running obviously isn't that applicable. But like, do we do linear running? Yes, we do. But I think if we were to cut and paste Charlie's prescriptions and then just insert it into a tennis program, I don't think it works very well at all. So that's where we do, if we need to do top-ups in conditioning, multi-directional tempo, and also some, I call it pattern recognition. So in terms of the girls will be playing obviously tennis, but they won't have a ball. So the NCAA rules, from a strength conditioning perspective, I can't do anything with a racket and a ball, because it's like it's weird, because at the end of the day, we're there to make them better at tennis, but I'm the strength guy, you know, I've got my strength hat on, like I'm not allowed to take that hat off. So as I think this profession evolves, we've got to obviously be able to take that hat off and then put our technical tactical hat on. And the more we can understand about the technical, tactical, psychological, the better we're going to be as a coach. So the way that we can bridge that gap is, okay, well, girls, you can't use a racket and the ball, but hey, we can still use a racket. So we're going to go on court. We're going to just kind of play opposite each other with no ball. And this is something I've been playing around with, and it seems to have worked quite well. So one thing I noticed was, and if you look at Roger Federer, the best in the game at doing this, he can identify before, roughly around like 0.83 seconds before the ball's been struck, kind of where the opponent is going to put the ball, which for us mere mortals is baffling. Okay. So this is something that I've kind of realized when we watch some of our best players. So like I say, I'm very lucky to work with some of the players that I do. We've got some guys that are currently ranked in in and around the world's top 200. So these very kind of elite level players, and it's just watching their habits and watching why they're successful. Now it comes back to the old thing, like success leaves clues. So as I'm watching these guys, I'm saying, well, he knows where the ball's going before these opponents hit it. He's doing something there to kind of, he's looking at something, he's identifying something in his opponent's movement that's informing his decision making. And it just got me thinking. I'm like, what is he doing? How does he know this? Because he's not our fastest guy over 0 to 10, for example. He's not even necessarily our fastest. He's up there, but on a 505. So kind of what is he doing that makes him elite in his sport that nobody else is doing? Because this guy was cleaning up in college tennis, like ridiculously good. So I'm kind of thinking, I'm having conversations with him, and it comes to the point that it comes down to pattern recognition. He understands the shapes that his opponent is trying to create, or is creating with his body. Therefore, a certain shape has a certain result. So he's able to identify the pattern in this really minuscule time frame, and he's got these certain points that he's picking up in his recognition, and then he knows where the ball's going to go. So getting back to kind of what I was talking about is what we're doing to kind of bridge the gap between the physical and the technical and tactical. Some of our conditioning, as we go into what's known in the NCAA as an 8-hour week, instead of coming out of a 20-hour training week, to help bridge that gap a little bit more, we do like pattern recognition conditioning drills where the athlete will be playing one-on-one on the court, just a racket in their hands. Now it feels a bit funny for them to start with, but it works unbelievably well. So they'll serve the ball in, and their opponent has got to guess where the ball's going based on the shapes that they see from their opponent's racket and body. So then they'll return the ball. And obviously, again, everything's just done off identifying shapes. Now, let's just say if an opponent hits like backhand line, so he goes down the line with the shot, and their opponent goes cross court, then that person can claim that point and say, no, I hit the ball line. And they've got to be very honest here. But the feedback I've had from that is phenomenal. And they say, no, it's really hard to do. And they've got to focus so much harder on their opponent and trying to pick up these subtle cues in movement. And I think that's somewhere that we can definitely learn. That's something I'm learning from, and I'm trying to identify even more, and something that we're trying to put into practice to help bridge that gap as well, just because we can't obviously have a ball in the racket involved. So we'll play like tie breaks with no ball, like feed the ball in, give them different drills to do, and they've got to identify their partner's movement. And if someone's shaping up to hit an inside-in forehand, there's certain cues that you can look for in racket position, hip position, shoulder position, where you know they're going to go. And it's, can you pick up those cues to put yourself into the best position? And if we look at kind of the OODA loop, can we kind of observe, orient, decide, and act, and put all of that kind of pattern into process quick enough to get to the ball before or to give you the best chance of being successful?
It reminds me of, I think, a chapter in the Sports Gene, if I'm not mistaken,
Mm-hmm.
where one of the first sports performance books I ever read, where he talks about baseball players not being able to hit softball pitches
Mm-hmm.
because, like you said, they're not actually looking at the ball. They're looking at the way the body moves, the way that the pitcher's body moves, to then determine what the ball is actually going to do, which is crazy, like you said, when you think about it. But that's really where the game is. So I find it really, really interesting that you've actually been able to include this kind of work into the conditioning of your players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's completely sport specific.
Mm-hmm.
If like you take them kind of out of that environment, put them into the baseball environment, for example, it is completely different. If I was to go in there and try and play, it's different again. So you have got to be so specific to your environment. And I think those skills do transfer a little bit, being able to kind of work in, if you're working in maybe like a field sport environment,
Mm-hmm.
Those skills have got more transfer than going and can transfer to kind of a court sport, for example, versus if you're just in kind of a volleyball, kind of that volleyball environment, and then try to go and play a field sport, which is quite interesting as well. Just as I've been digging, like definitely no expert on this by any means, but as I've been digging through some more of the research and trying to understand this a little bit better, that's the stuff that it comes back to. And a lot of the research is kind of underpinned by your experiences and your exposures. The more sport you're exposed to at a younger age,
Mm-hmm.
then the more successfully you can identify these different patterns. And that's why we stress so much like early specialization. We shouldn't do it. And you only specialize kind of obviously as you're getting older. But yeah, expose some of your experiences at the end of the day, and you need to be exposed to as many different stimuli as possible.
Got a couple more questions for you, Kris, today. So the first one would be, what would you like to see more of in the tennis performance field?
Less standing on Bosu balls, I think. And
Is it, is
actually,
there is there a lot of that going on?
there's quite a lot just generally like around the world, and actually just focus on good movement. Understand that strength is important. Like I said, it's not the be all and end all, but we've still got to have some level of strength. And I'd like to see coaches kind of putting a bit more like emphasis. I don't want to seem like I'm like banging the drum saying strength is everything, but I think it's some pretty low hanging fruit at the end of the day for a lot of tennis players, and we can get hold of that. I'd like to see a bit more education around the S&C side on the kind of tennis fitness in inverted commas side of things, because I think a lot of it is kind of underlooked at, underutilized. It's very much quite old school, and they're a long way behind. And like I said earlier, there's a lot of simulation instead of stimulation going on. And I think the more we can kind of get away from that and flip those roles a little bit, the better off we'll be.
If you had one piece of advice for tennis coaches wanting to get their players fitter, if they don't have access to an S&C structure or coach, what would you recommend they do?
I think just try and understand basic like physiology. Just pick up a textbook and try and get into that. Like without like, I know you plugged it a little bit earlier, but without kind of plugging myself, like check out the presentation that I've got on YouTube. It really does like show you what the sport demands are. And I've had coaches like kind of message me and say, oh wow, I didn't actually realize that's the demands of the sport. Like I sent it to our coach and he was amazed as well. And I think just doing that gives you more buy-in. Really just try to understand what's actually happening on the court, and you'll be amazed how many coaches who have been involved with the sport all of their lives don't actually understand the physiological principles behind what's going on. Couldn't tell you a work to rest ratio involved in their sport. What's the most common rally length? They couldn't tell you. And it's amazing for me. And these are some of the things that we do as part of or should be doing, in my opinion, as part of our needs analysis. It's dig into the weeds. Like, what's the average number of points per game? What's the worst case scenario for number of points per game? What's the average number of games per set? Worst case scenario for that. And just dig and dig and dig and dig. And when you think you can't dig anymore, dig a little bit more. Then once you've got this whole idea about tennis and you understand it, now once you essentially do understand it, you can start putting things into place. So with regards to like getting back to the tactical periodization side of things, if we know that serve and return is a very, very important factor, and coaches wouldn't argue with this, they say it is a very important factor. You know it's an important factor, then why don't you train it often enough? Like, why are you too concerned about taking 30 minutes for a warm-up, striking balls, going through, like hitting in the boxes, going forehand cross, backhand cross, serves, overheads, and taking all of this time instead of actually getting and just volume hitting, instead of actually getting to the stuff that really makes a difference, the high velocity movements on the court. So it's like, get educated in the sport itself. Like, no offense to the sports coaches that do a phenomenal job, but just if you, and it's like we do within the strength and conditioning profession all the time, like try to learn more and more and more. You're never really an expert. Just dig and dig and dig. And then when you think you know everything, throw those kind of ideas out and go and dig again and speak to some smarter people. And then once you've got that information, inform your programming on the field, on the court, whatever it is. Yeah, that's what I got there.
Kris, it's been a great pleasure chatting with you today, and thanks a lot for sharing all your great information on tennis S&C. Where can people find out more about what you do if they want to follow you?
Yeah, so I think the main, I'm on social media. I think the only account I really use is my Instagram account, and that's just at Kris Borthwick. That's Kris with a K. That quite often gets confused with the C, but there you go. But yeah, that's honestly the only one I use. I've got some stuff on my YouTube channel as well. If you just type Kris Borthwick in to YouTube, that'll come up. There's some different things, some presentations and whatnot on there as well. So yeah, hopefully that's useful to people. And thanks very much for having me on, Sean. Really appreciate it.
No, it's a pleasure. Like I said, I'll link the YouTube presentation that you made in the show notes for people to go and watch. So guys and gals, make sure you go and follow Kris on Instagram. Go check out his YouTube work as well. He's got a podcast going on. So a little plug for that, and make sure you go give it a listen. Kris, thanks again for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Cheers, buddy.
All right. Take care.